The rain had been falling since late afternoon, the kind that blurred the city lights and made Seattle feel smaller and quieter, and inside Mark and Emily's living room the four of them sat close together, laughing a little louder than usual, as if sound itself could fill the spaces that had slowly grown between their lives, and from the outside it looked like a perfect picture of friendship. Two married couples who had known each other for years, who shared holidays, inside jokes, and memories that felt stitched into their daily routines, but beneath the warmth of the lamps and the soft music playing low, something uneasy waited to surface, especially in Emily, who smiled when others spoke yet felt a tightness in her chest she could not explain, because her marriage to Mark was stable and kind but quiet in a way that scared her. A quiet where feelings were assumed instead of spoken, where days passed smoothly but without spark. And as she watched Claire laugh at something Daniel said, Emily felt a sudden sharp thought pass through her mind, not desire, not betrayal, but curiosity, the dangerous kind that asks what life might feel like if things were slightly different, and Mark noticed Emily's silence as he always did, noticing but not asking, because asking sometimes led to answers he was not ready to hear, and so the night moved forward with food, shared stories, gentle teasing, and glasses being refilled without anyone remembering who poured them, until the moment arrived. Without warning, when Emily set her glass down and said she wanted to ask something, her voice steady but softer than usual, and the air in the room shifted at once, because everyone sensed that this was not a joke, or a casual thought, and Claire leaned forward. Daniel stopped smiling, and Mark felt his shoulders tense even before Emily continued, and when she spoke about spending time differently, about learning more about themselves, about not changing love, but understanding it, her words fell carefully, as if she were crossing a narrow bridge, and when she finally said the idea out loud, about swapping partners in a careful, emotional way, the silence that followed was heavy and long, filled with confusion, shock, and unspoken fear, because the suggestion touched something fragile in all of them, something none had named before, and Mark's first feeling was panic mixed with hurt, a sharp instinct to protect what they had built, but beneath that was a quiet truth he had buried for years, that he too felt the distance, that he missed being seen instead of being understood by habit, and as he looked at Emily he did not see rebellion or coldness, but honesty and fear, and Daniel, always thoughtful, broke the silence by asking what she truly meant, not accusing, not agreeing, just seeking clarity, and Emily explained slowly, saying it was not about physical closeness, not about secrets or crossing lines, but about conversation, attention, and reflection, about seeing their relationships from a new angle before it was too late, and Claire listened with furrowed brows, her heart racing, because part of her wanted to reject the idea as dangerous and wrong, yet another part felt an ache she had carried quietly, the ache of feeling overlooked in her own marriage, loved but unheard, and as rain tapped harder against the windows, the four of them sat facing a truth none had planned to share, that comfort had replaced curiosity, that routine had softened passion, and that asking this question did not mean love was gone, only that it needed air, and Mark finally spoke, his voice calm, but unsure, saying he needed time to think, and Emily nodded, because she had expected nothing else, and the night ended not with arguments, or decisions, but with polite goodbyes and forced smiles, and when the door closed behind Daniel and Claire, Mark and Emily stood in silence, the space between them filled with words left unsaid, both aware that something important had begun, not because of the idea itself, but because for the first time in years, they had stopped pretending everything was fine, and as they went to bed that night, lying side by side yet awake, the question Emily asked echoed in both their minds, not as a threat, but as a mirror, reflecting the fragile truth that love, when ignored, does not disappear, it waits, and sometimes it demands to be seen in ways no one expects. The days after that night moved quickly, as if time itself was pushing them forward before doubt could stop them, and after several honest talks filled with pauses, careful words, and nervous agreement, the four of them decided to try the idea with clear rules that felt more like safety lines than freedom, no secrets, no lies, no physical closeness, and the promise to stop the moment it felt wrong. And once the decision was made, everything felt sharper, sounds louder, emotions closer to the surface, and Mark found himself meeting Claire for coffee on a grey morning near the waterfront, where the smell of the sea mixed with fresh bread from a nearby cafe. And at first their talk stayed safe, circling work and daily routines, until Claire admitted she felt strange even being there, her hands wrapped tightly around her cup as if it could steady her, and Mark answered honestly, saying he felt the same, but something about sitting with someone who expected nothing from him allowed his shoulders to relax, and slowly the conversation deepened, not by plan, but by need. As Claire spoke about how Daniel loved her, but often lived inside his thoughts, how she missed feeling noticed in small ways, and Mark listened without trying to fix anything, realizing how rarely he listened without preparing a response. And across the city Emily walked with Daniel through a quiet park, leaves falling under their steps, where Daniel asked questions gently, not rushing her answers, and Emily found herself talking about her fears of becoming invisible in her own life, of waking up one day and realizing she had been quiet for too long, and Daniel shared his own worries about failing as a husband despite his good intentions, and when they parted both felt lighter and uneasy at the same time, as if they had opened a door they were not sure they could close. And when everyone returned home that evening, no one shared every detail, not out of dishonesty, but because the feelings were still forming, too fragile to explain, and nights became restless as thoughts replayed conversations, words carrying more weight than they should have. And over the following weeks the meetings continued, sometimes over lunch, sometimes during long walks or quiet drives, and each time the connections felt easier, more natural, not romantic in action, but emotional in depth, as if they were rediscovering parts of themselves long ignored. And Mark noticed how Claire's honesty made him reflect on his own marriage, on how he had assumed love was enough without tending to it, while Emily realized how much she missed being asked how she truly felt instead of how her day went. And guilt followed close behind these discoveries, not sharp, but heavy, because no one wanted to hurt the person they had promised their life to, yet the truth was impossible to deny, and small moments began to linger longer than expected. The shared laugh, a thoughtful message, a silence that felt safe instead of awkward, and each of them struggled privately with the same fear, that understanding someone else so deeply might change how they saw their own partner. And one evening, as Mark drove home alone, city lights stretching ahead, he admitted to himself that this experience was not pulling him away from Emily but forcing him to see how far they had drifted. And at the same time Emily stood in her kitchen reading a short, kind message from Daniel, nothing more than concern, yet it touched something tender in her chest, and she realized this experiment was no longer just about curiosity. It was revealing truths they had carefully avoided. And as the weeks passed, the pace of life did not slow, but inside each of them a quiet pressure built, the sense that this path, once started, could not remain harmless forever. And though no boundaries were crossed, emotions do not always ask permission, and by the end of those weeks, all four knew they were standing closer to a line than any of them had planned, unsure whether stepping back would save what they had or whether moving forward was the only honest choice left. The shift came quietly but firmly, like a tide that no one noticed until it was already at their feet. And by the time anyone tried to name what was happening, the feelings had already taken shape, growing stronger with every conversation and shared silence. And Mark began to notice that his thoughts returned to Claire more often than he expected, not in longing but in reflection, because being with her reminded him of a version of himself that used to speak freely, ask questions, and feel curious about the world. And this realization filled him with both warmth and regret, while Claire, on her side, felt seen in a way that felt unfamiliar and dangerous, as if someone had finally turned a light on in a room she had lived in the dark for years. And across the city Emily and Daniel found their talks stretching longer, their words slower and more careful, not because they lacked things to say, but because each sentence carried meaning. And Emily realized how deeply she missed being understood without needing to explain herself twice. And Daniel, who had always believed effort was shown through action, began to understand the power of attention. And as these emotional ties grew, so did the weight of guilt, following every smile with a shadow, because none of them wanted to betray the trust they had built over years of marriage and friendship. And nights became the hardest, when thoughts grew louder and distractions fell away, and Mark lay awake beside Emily wondering when love had become routine, while Emily stared at the ceiling feeling torn between gratitude for her marriage and grief for what it lacked. And small moments began to feel too meaningful. A message sent late at night, a shared laugh that echoed longer than it should have, a pause before saying goodbye, and each of them sensed that something had crossed an invisible line, not in action, but in emotion, and the fear was not of scandal or judgment, but of truth, because once seen, it could not be unseen. And one evening Emily stood alone in her kitchen holding her phone, reading a short message from Daniel asking if she was okay, and tears surprised her. Not because of him, but because of what his simple care revealed about her own loneliness. And that night she knew they could not continue pretending this was harmless, and when she spoke to Mark, her voice steady but filled with pain, she admitted that the experience had worked too well, that it had shown her what she missed and what she feared losing, and Mark listened without interruption, recognizing the same conflict inside himself. And later that same night Daniel and Claire had their own difficult conversation, acknowledging that something honest but painful had surfaced, and by the end of those talks, all four understood that the experiment had done its job, not by fixing anything, but by exposing truths they had avoided, and now they stood at a moment where every choice carried weight, because stopping would mean returning to silence, and continuing would mean facing consequences none of them could fully predict. And in that fragile space between comfort and courage, each of them felt the same question rise quietly in their heart. What does love ask for when it is no longer enough to simply stay? They met again on a quiet Sunday evening in the same living room where everything had started, but the mood was different now, heavier yet clearer. As if the truth had finally caught up with all of them, and no one pretended to be relaxed, because there was no need anymore. And Mark spoke first, not loudly but firmly, saying he did not want to lose Emily yet could not ignore what they had learned, that love without attention slowly turns into distance. And Emily listened with tears in her eyes, not because she disagreed, but because she felt seen for the first time in years. And when she spoke, she did not blame or accuse, she simply admitted she had been afraid of becoming invisible in her own life, afraid that silence would slowly erase who she was. And Daniel nodded in understanding, realizing that his own good intentions had not protected his marriage from quiet neglect, while Claire, holding herself steady, spoke about how being heard had reminded her that she still mattered, that she still had a voice worth listening to. And as each of them spoke, the room filled with honesty instead of tension, and something gentle but powerful settled between them, because no one was fighting anymore. And Mark reached for Emily's hand, choosing presence over pride, and said he wanted to rebuild, not return to how things were, but move forward with intention, with effort, with courage. And Emily squeezed his hand, knowing the path would not be easy but feeling hope for the first time in a long while. And Daniel looked at Claire with sadness and respect, admitting that love alone had not been enough, that they both needed space to understand who they had become. And Claire agreed, not in anger but in clarity, knowing that staying together out of fear would only deepen the quiet pain. And so choices were made that night, not dramatic or loud, but firm and honest, with Mark and Emily choosing to stay and work through the distance with open conversations and professional help, and Daniel and Claire choosing time apart, not as a failure but as a step toward truth. And in the weeks that followed, life did not magically improve, but it moved forward with intention, with difficult talks and small changes that slowly added up. And Mark learned to ask instead of assume, while Emily learned to speak instead of hold back. And though rebuilding took time, their home slowly filled with warmth again, while Daniel and Claire faced their own journey of reflection, learning that sometimes love means letting go of what no longer fits. And months later, as seasons changed, Emily often thought back to the night she had spoken the words that changed everything, realizing that suggesting the swap had never been about wanting someone else, but about wanting to feel alive, understood, and connected. And she understood now that the experiment had not broken their lives, but cracked them open just enough to let truth in. And as she stood one evening, watching the sunset beside Mark, she felt something quiet, but strong settle in her heart, the knowledge that honesty, even when painful, is sometimes the most loving choice of all.